Hey, Sean. So, what's the story with this podcast?
Good question, Sean. It's my understanding that two middle-aged Seans are getting together to decide whether art is shit or not.
Like Sean versus Sean.
Exactly. One Sean knows a lot about art and the other Sean a lot about insurance.
Both are very middle aged and very Sean.
So, is art shit?
Let's see what Sean has to say about it.
Oh yeah, 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 oh yeah.
This episode is going to talk about what I consider to be probably, at least for me, the origin story almost of when I started thinking perhaps there was some stuff out there called art that perhaps was shit instead of art. I can't remember where I first saw a white painting, and I think in my memory I also saw a red painting. Maybe I'm misremembering now, but all those years ago, in a gallery of some renown, it might have been in New York, but in my head it's in Europe. I don't know. I saw a white painting and I immediately went, "What the fuck's going on here? How is this guy getting away with it?" Now I don't know if it was this one. What we're going to talk about in this episode is Robert Rauschenberg's white painting series from 1951. And what I'll do is just describe what these, and I'm doing air quotes here, paintings are. So these are objectively white paint on canvas in a series, white canvas painted with white house paint.
Well, there are a number of them in the Museum of Modern Art in New York, in the Museum of Modern Art in San Francisco, amongst other places. So, they're painted not only by the artist, but by his friend. But we'll get into that.
Yeah, well, that makes me even angrier. So my memory, and I think I was a kid when I first saw, white paintings or monochromatic paintings of whatever type they were, and like I said, I can't remember if it was Rauschenberg or somebody else that I saw, but I remember standing there with my dad and looking at it, and we were both going, "What the hell's this world coming to? How is this getting up on the wall?" And it comes back to if I can do it, how good is it? It's basically the guy went into an art supply store, bought a few canvases, and the guy says, "Do you want some paint with that?" "No, mate, I'll pick it up at the hardware store on the way home. I'm not even going to get artist paint." And then he uses house paint and paints it. And then there's the whole story about what it means and things like that. And I think this is one of the very obvious ones that art consumers have real trouble getting their head around what's going on. So I think this episode will be informative for those people and hopefully for myself as well.
So there are two very different histories that converge in this work. So you've probably heard more broadly about abstract painting and the history of abstract painting, which unfolded across the 20th century. And in a way, it represented one of the twin faces of the radical modernist project in art, the other being the ready-made, which is the selection of objects from everyday life. Now, the monochromatic painting, which has its origins somewhere in the early 20th century, whether it was Rodchenko famously claiming that he'd made the last painting, which only ended up being the first last painting, and Casimir Malevich's famous Black Square. Around the same time, we saw the emergence of the ready-made, this idea that an ordinary object can be brought into art and attributed the status of art.
Well, I think we'll talk about that in a future episode, bringing in an old urinal and putting it on a pedestal.
Well, it's actually relevant for this episode, but we'll get to that. So first of all, we established that those two histories, at least for the first half of the 20th century, sort of tracked along quite separately. We might say that they were twin faces of a radical or avant-garde modernist project. But for reasons that we'll hopefully uncover in this episode, they converge in Robert Rauschenberg.
Oh, I can't wait to hear the story. You mentioned something really interesting that I read about. So the monochromatic painting, as far as I could tell, what's the OG? What's the original one? The black on black? Is that one of the originals?
Well, yeah, I'm not a big fan of the mythology of origin stories, but certainly two artists that come up in the history of abstract painting as declaring the first monochromes are Casimir Malevich and Alexander Rodchenko.
Okay.
And as I mentioned a moment ago, one declared the end of painting. Nothing more to see here. That's it. And the other one was like
to its greatest extreme. No, you haven't, mate.
And whereas the other one was inviting us to look in or beyond. And of course, across the 20th century, we saw a continuum that ran from quasi-metaphysical or spiritual experience through to, artists that offered the monochrome as somewhat of a middle finger to art history. So there are a whole range of different forms of monochromatic painting. And I guess you might look at the rich material qualities of the surface in one, and the other, you might just see it as a sign. You might just see it as something that's contributing to a chain of claims within art historical trajectories.
Well, when I looked at the white paintings, it created a response, maybe not the one they were after, and maybe that's part of it. I remember my dad having a similar reaction. What is this, and how does an artist call themselves an artist if that's what they're painting? Because it's it is, well, the whole context of it being considered really great art when objectively it's so simple is confronting.
Well, I mentioned earlier that Rauschenberg can be understood not only in relationship to this history of painting and of radical reduction in the logic of abstraction, but also this idea of the everyday, of bringing everyday objects into the space of art and to merging art and life. Robert Rauschenberg, who was working after World War II, is regarded as part of the neo-avant-garde generation. And the neo-avant-garde artists were responding to a smaller group of artists from the early 20th century, the historical avant-gardes. And despite that sense that people sort of heap a whole lot of significance on the early 20th century historical avant-gardes, in some ways, we should give credit to this post-Second World War generation for really understanding the critical artistic potential of what they were doing and applying it in a whole range of new ways in the 50s, 60s and beyond. But what Robert Rauschenberg did with this series was to take this idea of the everyday and this effective merging of art and life, this question that the artists such as Duchamp and others were asking, which is, how can we really meaningfully distinguish everyday life from the deification of art objects? And that there's this sort of interesting ambiguity that sits between art and life. And I'm going to read a quote from another artist, Robert Rauschenberg, who I think illustrates this point quite nicely. He said that art is what makes life more interesting than art. So there's this way that this sense that art as a problem, as a question, can invite us to think about things that are beyond art. And that in some ways, there's a paradox at play here because these artists are creating anti-art that's inviting us to think about life differently. They're opening up a different relationship between art and life.
Yep.
Robert Rauschenberg was using everyday house paint. For him, anyone could reproduce his works. But it wasn't as if the technical finesse of the artist was important. he created a stage, if you will, for an idea to unfold. And a contemporary of his, who had been his teacher at Black Mountain College, the famous avant-garde musician John Cage, noticed that these paintings, in their everydayness, offered very little, no content. They offered the viewer nothing, but in doing so, they invited the viewer to notice particularities in the world around them. The way that the light reflected on the surface, the way that dust collected on the surface.
Yeah. That's the art.
Well, the content is created by its relationship to the world around it. It's happenstance. Yeah. It's utterly continuous with the world. And so John Cage's famous 4 minutes 33, in a way, was inspired by this, where he wrote a piece of music, which was essentially a piece of music in which no notes are performed, but given that it's presented as a performance of music, it invites the happenstance of the sounds that invariably surround us all the time to become the content of the work. So it invites us to really listen in the way that perhaps the white paintings invite us to really look.
Yeah. Okay. Well, you know what? I think I've been down this rabbit hole far enough that you're actually making that link make sense, which is just nuts. So from the layman's point of view, a guy who just paints white, it then kind of graduates to a guy who writes music with no music, well, no audible music.
Well, no, we should say it's a composition in which no notes are played, but it's important to understand that it's a composition in which no notes are played.
Yeah, yeah, that's a bit of a stretch.
Well, you experience it as a performance. You walk into it's been performed by single pianists. It's been performed by an orchestra. You sit there, it's in 3 acts. There's a conductor. There are performers on a stage. So you're invited to receive it through the ontology of music, which invites you to listen, because the whole experience is inviting you to listen. But when no notes are played, it becomes continuous with the world. The sound of the world becomes the content, because there's nothing else. And the same way, Robert Rauschenberg's work, given that it gives you nothing, there is no content, there is no subject. Because you've got nowhere else to look, you start to notice other particularities in the world. And as John Cage pointed out, the freshly painted ones worked the best, which is why he invited people to reproduce them over time, because they reflected the light of the room as you moved around, and you became aware of, as I mentioned before, the dust collecting on the surface, because the conspicuous absence of anything else is inviting a particular way of looking and experiencing.
Yeah, so the person going in looking at the art is desperately looking to find the art, like urgently, because they're looking at it and saying, is that it? Can that be it? And then they question themselves. Maybe it's me. Am I reading it wrong? You know, that sort of thing.
John Cage wrote a statement which accompanied the exhibition of Robert Rauschenberg's white paintings in 1953. And it read in part, "To whom? No subject, no image, no taste, no object, no beauty, no message, no talent, no technique, no why, no idea, no intention, no art, no object, no feeling, no black, no white."
Yeah, well, the guy's got exactly my thoughts. I think he nailed it. That's exactly what I was thinking. He's made my point for me.
As we variously explore across this podcast series, art is a socially constructed space. It is something that exists because, for better or worse, humans agree that despite the fact that there are things in the world, physical, material things in the world, we attribute those things particular status. Not only do we do this as art, we do it in all sorts of other ways. Something is not only an object It's also a symbol for the deity of a religion. Humans inscribe a symbolic value over objects in the world routinely as part of the way that we exist. Something might be an object made of stone, but it's also understood to represent a deity. People may even pray to it. A canvas with pigment on it is a thing in the world, but we not only see an image in it, we also understand it to be art. And in doing so, we're responding to a socially inscribed, or what we might say is the symbolic order over the real being the stuff in the world, the symbolic order being the language and the social order that we bring to bear upon. We do that to our own bodies as well. We are desiring, consuming mortal beings, but we also construct language and money and politics and art. And those things are profoundly, oddly configured. And some of the strangest things happen, and in some ways through art, in trying to explore the contradictions between the real and the symbolic. Well, that's the curious thing, is that we need some kind of consensus, some sort of transmission from one mind or minds to another, and a context, an agreed context in which to receive that transmission. And as a consequence of that relationship between material and language, we accept that something is art. Of course, contemporary art has radically expanded the possible means for what can give rise to art, such that anything can be art. But the curious thing is that everything isn't. So earlier in the 20th century, a group of artists were trying to break down that distinction between, shall we say, mere real life and this deified space of art by pointing to the absurdity at play in making that distinction. And that at its core, with the Dada artists, and Robert Rauschenberg was a neo-Dada artist who were interested in breaking down that distinction between art and life. That's quite a separate history to the history of abstract painting and of reduction of the image to the monochrome painting being the most radically reduced form of abstraction. But with Rauschenberg, we started to see those two trajectories merge. And now, today, contemporary art is indebted to both of those legacies.
So they're reducing it as far as they can possibly go until it'll be so close to nothing that there's almost nowhere left to go.
Well, this is where it becomes philosophically interesting, because when it is reduced to its barest form, it becomes more conspicuously obvious what its distinguishing ingredient is.
Right. I'm not sure I've caught that entirely. But it seems to me like a competition, like a race to the bottom. Who can do the least art and get away with calling it art?
Well, certainly there was a sense of, I don't know if I'd call it competition, but there was certainly a sense of radical pushing of boundaries that was underpinning artistic production through the 20th century. But today, contemporary artists draw upon all of these various ways in which artists in the 20th century pushed things to the edge of every possible idea of concept and medium and mode of display, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And they draw upon all of these ideas as tools, usually to explore other kinds of ideas or to make other kinds of things. Because as a contemporary artist, I accept many of these ideas almost like a classical horizon. These are all the things they did in order to give us the tools to make the kind of art we make today.
Yeah.
But no longer in and of itself particularly interesting to simply push those boundaries today. But it is interesting to use those boundaries to explore new ideas or to do new things with them.
Yeah.
Another work that Robert Rauschenberg produced at around the same time, which also, I think, can be talked about in terms of this convergence of those two very different histories of the found or the ready-made pre-existing object or image or thing in the world, and this idea of radical reduction, was a work called Erased de Kooning. Now, a then superstar of abstract expressionist art, de Kooning, Robert Rauschenberg, managed to talk him into giving him a drawing to erase. And so we now have this work called Erased de Kooning, which is what looks like a blank piece of paper, although if you look at it very carefully, you can see the significant labor that went into erasing the image. Again, this convergence of reduction and, I guess, what we'll call appropriation or the ready-made existing in a single work. So around this time, there are artists like Robert Rauschenberg exemplify this convergence of former avant-garde tendencies into new languages that would form the basis for what would become contemporary art.
Let me just reflect on that. So he's taken a famous artist's work. How famous was the work itself before he erased it? Was that work in and of itself a famous work?
The artist was hugely famous, but he talked him into doing a drawing for him to erase. And de Kooning deliberately made it difficult to erase.
Yeah. He put a lot on there for him to then erase. Yeah, and it was months of work for him to erase it, and many. I
don't know if it was months of work, but there was significant labour. But I don't think labour is really the point here.
No, I don't think so. It's very clearly not. No.
Yeah.
So he erases the work, and there's some trace elements of it left, and that's the new work, Erased de Kooning.
Yes, by Robert Rauschenberg.
Yeah, yep. Well, I'm glad I didn't see that one with my dad.
So there was a Black Mountain College was a radical interdisciplinary school where dancers and musicians and visual artists were working together from the 30s through to the late 50s, 60s. But at its height, at this point when John Cage and Robert Rauschenberg would have met there, this is where these ideas were being applied, translated across media.
Yeah,
very very interesting time in the radical expansion of art and its possibilities.
Yeah, I can imagine. And so that takes us to where we are now. Let's talk about whether or not white paintings, Robert Rauschenberg, is this art shit?
Well, would you like my verdict, or do you want to offer your verdict?
I think I know your verdict. No, it's clear. You embrace it fully as substantial works in art history. I like the story that this tells, but looking at the painting by itself doesn't tell me that story. Hearing it from you and reading about where it came from is interesting. The work itself is still just a piece of canvas with white house paint on it, and so from the layman's point of view, it's really difficult to get your head around. Not everybody has a art professor in their pocket.
I'm going to go out on a limb here and throw another red herring in.
Okay.
I'm going to claim that to decide whether it's shit or not is to ask the wrong question of it.
Oh, okay. Oh, well, my immediate question, I think, if I reflect back to seeing it, is how did he get away with it? And quite obviously, that's the wrong question, right? Well, I think that's like, I know this probably isn't going to go in the podcast, but that was the wrong question that started this whole idea. I think you were talking about somebody climbing Mount Wellington in the nude and there's a guy videotaping him or something like that, right? And I'm like, how do you make money out of that? And your immediate answer was, that's the wrong question.
Yes, that was Mark Shorter, a Melbourne-based artist, in his alter ego Schleimgurgeln, the time-traveling German landscape painting critic, who covers himself in flour and honey, and then walks through the subjects of European landscape paintings in the now unfortunately declared terra nullius that is Australia.
Yeah, and my question was more, how does this guy pay his rent than anything else?
He's the head of sculpture at the VCA.
That is so perfect. This is so perfect. That's gold. So, from the layman's point of view, the art itself, white paintings, pretty shit. But what it evokes, not shit.
So you're referring to the series of white paintings,
or
the white painting?
Okay. I found this on the web for the series of white paintings.
Oh my god!
Check it out.
Sorry, Siri just kicked in because we said series. Stupid.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Oh yeah.